Think about the worst day of your life, the hardest one, the one that cost you the most to get through. Now imagine that day doesn't last 24 hours. It lasts your entire life. From the moment you're born to the moment you die, hunger, cold, violence, disease, without relief, without any reason to believe tomorrow will be different. That's not a horror story. That was the reality for millions of human beings during one specific period in history. And historians and scientists have a name for it. What was the worst moment in history to be born as a human? The answer is going to surprise you. For most of human history, life was hard, but not always in the same way. There were periods of relative stability, times when humans found rhythms, built communities, learned to survive with what they had. And then there was a period that researchers describe as the most complete collapse of human conditions ever documented. It wasn't a war, it wasn't a plague. It was something far more silent and far more devastating. In 2018, historian Kyle Harper at the University of Oklahoma published a book that changed how we understand human suffering at historical scale. It's called The Fate of Rome. His central argument is this: the period between the 3rd and 6th centuries AD was, with high probability, the worst time in recorded history to be a living human being in the Western world. Not for one reason, but because of the perfect convergence of every reason at the same time. Catastrophic climate change, unprecedented pandemics, total economic collapse, systemic political violence, everything at the same time. For generations. Let's start with something nobody associates with Rome: the weather. For centuries, the Roman Empire benefited from what scientists call the Roman climate optimum, a period of stable temperatures, predictable rainfall, and abundant harvest that lasted from roughly 200 BC to 150 AD. It was the invisible foundation of the empire. Farms produced, rivers flowed, people ate. And then everything changed. From the 3rd century onward, the Mediterranean climate began to collapse. Temperatures dropped, droughts became frequent, harvest failed year after year. Scientists know this with precision because they read it in tree rings, polar ice cores, and ocean floor sediments. The record is clear. Around 536 AD, a volcano, possibly in Iceland, ejected so much ash into the atmosphere that the sun stopped shining normally for 18 months. Global temperatures dropped between 1.5 and 2.5 degrees Celsius. Crops died across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Medieval historian Michael McCormick at Harvard called 536 AD the worst year to be alive in the entire historical record. His words, not mine. But the cold and the hunger didn't come alone. They came with something worse. In 541 AD, a bacterium called Yersinia pestis arrived in the Roman Empire from Central Asia. We know it today as the bubonic plague, but this wasn't the Black Death of the 14th century that you already know. This was the first one, and in many ways, it was worse. The Plague of Justinian, named after the emperor who ruled at the time, killed between 25 and 50 million people in less than 2 centuries. That was between 25 and 50% of the entire population of the Roman Empire at that moment. In Constantinople, the capital of the empire, up to 10,000 people were dying per day at the worst moments. Historian Procopius, who lived through the plague, wrote that the living were no longer sufficient to bury the dead. The streets were full of bodies, fields unplowed, cities empty, and while the plague killed, the cold of 536 still hadn't left. Here's where it gets truly dark, because the climate and the plague weren't the only problems. The Roman Empire, which had been the most stable political structure in the Western world for centuries, was fragmenting. Taxes kept rising while services disappeared. Armies dissolved. Trade routes collapsed. Cities that had flourished for centuries emptied within decades. Archaeologist Brian Ward-Perkins at Oxford studied the material record of this period: pottery fragments, animal bones, building remains, and found something that disturbed him deeply. The standard of living in Britain at the end of the Roman period fell to levels not seen since the Bronze Age. 1,000 years of progress, erased in less than a century. People stopped using coins, stopped reading, stopped building in stone. Not because they didn't want to, but because the system that made all of that possible had simply vanished. Now imagine being born in 536 AD. You arrive in a winter that never ends. Your mother is malnourished because the harvests have been failing for years. Your father pays taxes he cannot pay to an empire that no longer protects anything. When you are 5 years old, the plague reaches your city. Half the people you know die within weeks. When you are 10, the armies that once kept order are gone. The roads are dangerous. The local market no longer exists. If you reach 30, which was not guaranteed, you will have lived your entire adult life without seeing a single generation of improvement. No visible progress. No documented reason to believe tomorrow would be better than today. Paleopathologists, scientists who study disease in ancient bones, have analyzed the skeletons from this period. They find evidence of chronic malnutrition, repeated infectious disease, and extreme physical stress from very early ages. The bodies tell the story that books don't always mention. We don't tell this story to glorify suffering. We tell it because there is something in it that matters today. The humans who lived in 536 AD didn't know they were in the worst moment in history. They had nothing to compare it to. They only knew that every day was a struggle. And yet they survived. They built communities in the ruins. They found ways to keep going. It took centuries before the world returned to anything resembling stability, but they survived. The next time you feel like the world is collapsing, and sometimes it does feel that way, remember that there were human beings who lived entire decades without seeing a single day of relief. And they kept going, not because they had guaranteed hope, but because keeping going was the only thing they knew how to do. That is also in your ancestral programming, and it has never left you.